Hey everyone, I just wanted to hop on camera and shoot a little update video regarding the Ronbus Ripple. I know there has been a lot of confusion and questions regarding this paddle, so I figured doing an update video may be helpful. I just want to go over a brief timeline and all the news and updates that I have been able to track down, as well as some of my thoughts. So with that, let's jump into it. In July of 2024, we were supposed to see the release of the original Ronbus Ripple. Two shapes were set to release in the R1 and the R2. Both of these paddles were 16 millimeters, but with 1 week before the release, they were caught up in a major delisting alongside the original Yola Gen 3s and the Vatic Pro Oni, both of which had either recently released or literally just released. Months later, Ronbus announced that they would be able to release the 14 millimeter variant of the Ripple as they would pass all current USAP regulations. And this would fall in line with what we have seen from paddles like the original Gen 3s from Yola, where the 14 millimeter would hit less hard than the 16 millimeter counterparts. And this would be due to the trampoline effect from the core. We then see the 14 millimeter variants of the R1 and R2 shapes show up on the USAP approved list in late July of last year. At this point, all seems fine and the release is good to go. But this is where things get a bit complicated. USAP had announced a new test to replace deflection known as the PB core test. This test was put in place with new limits to hopefully limit power and have a more accurate form of measurement than what they had been doing previously. However, skipping ahead to today for a second, this test still has flaws, but it is said to be a better measurement than what they were using before. USAP did announce that they will be sunsetting the Yola Mod TA15 and the Gearbox Pro Power Elongated, as well as several Pro Kennex paddles starting July 1st of 2025. To my understanding, the PB core test through the end of 2025 is a PB core test result of 0.44, which means we may see more paddle delistings in 2026. However, all new paddles that are now releasing have been subject to the PB core standard of 0.43. With all this to be said, twice right before release, Ronbus has been hit with USAP moving the goalposts. Now, let's get into all the versions of the Ripple. There was the original alpha and beta paddles, which is what majority of consumers seem to have in the wild, which is a paddle that can be identified by having waves in the face. The surface of the paddle is not supposed to have these ripples or waves, according to USAP, so Ronbus corrected that as well as fixing some edgeguard issues. Only Connect members were able to get access to the Ripple and demand was high, with the paddle selling out instantly to its Connect members every time it released, last to my knowledge being in September. And Ronbus had then planned a public release date for December 6th. However, that December 6th date never came, and the paddle was delayed yet again. Now, there were two more versions sent to reviewers after these beta paddles. One that hit significantly harder than the original paddle, and another that also hit harder, but maybe slightly less. This second paddle had the addition of the PB Core 0.43 certified stamped right above the handle. The owner Dong stated that the production model with the stamp was ready to go, but he was just waiting for PB Core test results from USAP before releasing the paddle. Now, this is where I got a bit concerned, as other reviewers were reporting that several brands said no one is receiving these PB Core test results even after paying USAP for it. Yet, two brands I reached out to were able to provide their test results showing PB Core numbers on USAP paper. They both assured me that the results are emailed over within 48 hours of the paddle actually being tested. Both of these companies had submitted brand new paddles, so maybe there was a delay for Ronbus considering their original paddle had passed and he was waiting for recertification with the new USAP requirements for PB Core. Then, on January 17th, Dong from Ronbus stated that he had now had written confirmation from USAP that the R1 Ripple 14mm had passed and was good to go. Now, this is where things get a bit tricky, and it's a bit he said, she said. USAP and Ronbus both released statements essentially blaming the other party. I'll leave those up on the screen if you want to pause. My guess is the truth is likely somewhere in between. With my test unit of the release version of the R1 Ripple with the PB Core stamp above the handle, I had some concerns. My speed tests with this paddle were 5 miles per hour more than the second place paddle on that list, which happened to be the Beta R2 Ripple. My release R1 Ripple was clocking an average of 59 miles per hour with a top speed of 63 miles per hour. Now for context, my Beta R2 Ripple had an average of 54.9 miles per hour with a top speed of 58 miles per hour. I had already been complaining about the original Beta being an issue with having too much power, but this release R1 Ripple just seemed off. It was certainly hard for me to believe that this paddle had passed the new regulations when it was hitting 5.4 miles per hour faster than the Yola Gen 3S in my speed testing, as well as 4.1 miles per hour faster than my Beta R2 Ripple. And with my and others' suspicions, on January 30th of this year, Ronbus announced a day before its last updated release date that the Ripple was yet again delayed, as USAP stated the paddle was not approved. But how could this be possible? Ronbus stated that USAP requested them to overnight additional units for further testing, which later failed USAP's PB Core testing. Ronbus then stated they are working to investigate the cause of what happened and retesting on their own PB Core test machine, as they were confident the release version should have passed. USAP at their recent media day said that Ronbus had only done the individual PB Core testing at the same lab that USAP uses, which companies are able to do at a much lower price. However, USAP stated they were never sent the final production models for approval until after they requested the overnight shipment from Ronbus. So my question is, what paddle got approved? Did Ronbus pull a bait and switch, or is USAP at fault? My honest opinion is that both parties are probably at fault in some regard. USAP is trying to catch up and meet the demands of brands and consumers for clear and concise parameters to protect the game of pickleball. In doing so, they have continued to move goalposts, which Ronbus has now been caught up in at the release twice in the past 12 months. One would argue that USAP is responding retroactively to these problems that started with Yola, versus being proactive so these problems don't happen in the first place. Seems clear that some of these paddles should have never been approved in the first place, but on the flip side, companies have had multiple versions of paddles, and these might be slipping through the cracks. And theoretically, they would be able to submit a slightly different paddle to USAP for approval, and then pull a bait and switch with the production models the company then sends out to the public. This seemed to be USAP's reasoning for delisting those original Yola Gen 3 paddles. But then they allowed the Yola Mod TA15 to release, which was identical to the original Yola Gen 3s outside of the face grit, and they allowed these to be on the market for what would be around a year before they list them on July 1st of this year. So the question is, did Ronbus do something similar? It is very confusing with how many versions of the Ripple are out that all look the same. Outside of the PB Core stamp on the release version of the R1 Ripple, the previous 3 versions all look identical, only with some having waves and some not. My biggest problem going on with this whole debacle between Ronbus and USAP is, why is the Ripple still showing approved on the approved list if it has been determined that the waves or ripples in the face should make this paddle out of compliance with USAP's rules? This only further adds to the confusion of which paddles are passing. I certainly hope we get some clear communication from both parties going forward, and that the Ripple does finally see a release date. I just hope the paddle meets the specs and USAP doesn't change their minds again at the last hour. I would love to hear your opinions down in the comments. Who do you think's at fault? And are you even still looking forward to the Ronbus Ripple? That's all my thoughts. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.